The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Seo Jahan decided he was going to die in this parking garage. Not literally, but the way his legs had stopped cooperating somewhere between the fourth and fifth level, the way his vision kept blurring at the edges, the way the suppressant patch on his inner wrist had stopped doing anything useful around midnight, it felt close enough to dying that the distinction barely mattered. He pressed himself against a concrete pillar, listening. Footsteps 2 levels down, patient, methodical, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who wasn't worried about catching him because they already knew they would. Director Choi's men, of course. Jihan pressed his palm flat against the cold concrete and tried to think. 6 months ago, he'd been the most sought-after interior designer in Busan. His firm, Meridian Studio, had won 3 consecutive awards for spatial innovation. He'd had a team of 12, a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, and a reputation that made clients fly in from Tokyo and Singapore. Then he'd made the mistake of falling for Ryu Seongmin. Or rather, Ryu Seongmin had made the mistake of deciding Jihan belonged to him. The bond hadn't been consensual. Jihan understood that now with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass. At the time, Seongmin had framed it as inevitable, as biological destiny, as proof of how deeply he was loved. You responded to me, your body knew before your mind did. That's not something you argue with, Jihana. The suppressants had been rationed, then withheld entirely. The heats had come too frequently, too overwhelmingly. By the time Jihan understood the shape of the trap, its walls were already too high to see over. Leaving had taken 8 months of careful, terrifying planning. 3 days ago, he'd finally run. And now Seongmin's men were 2 levels below him in a parking garage in Seoul, and Jihan's body was staging its own betrayal. The familiar crawling warmth beginning beneath his skin that meant his emergency suppressants were failing ahead of schedule. Move, he told himself, you don't get to stop yet. He moved. The stairwell exit onto the street level was locked from the outside, he'd already checked. The elevator required a key card. The one other exit he'd found led into a loading dock that opened onto an alley, and the alley connected to a main street, and main streets meant people, meant cameras, meant somewhere Seongmin couldn't touch him without witnesses. Jihan had always been good at spatial reasoning, understanding how spaces connected, where the breathing room existed, how to move through a building's architecture with purpose. It was why he was exceptional at his work. Right now, it was the only thing keeping him alive. He reached the loading dock at a near sprint, shoved through the heavy door, stumbled into rain-soaked alley air that smelled like exhaust and wet asphalt, and something faintly floral from a restaurant 2 buildings over. His shoes hit a puddle. His torn blazer offered nothing against the cold. Behind him, a door slammed open, a shout they'd heard him. Jihan ran. He didn't know this district. Seongmin had controlled his movements so thoroughly for the past year that Seoul felt like a foreign city despite the 2 years he'd spent living here. The streets blurred past him, convenience stores, a shuttered flower shop, a pajing matcha with its orange tarp flapping in the wind, a row of buildings with dark windows. Then one that wasn't dark. It was set back slightly from the street, distinguished from its neighbors by the quality of its restraint. No signage, no indication of purpose, just a facade of dark stone and frosted glass panels, warm amber light bleeding from the edges of 2 large doors made of what looked like black walnut, and a single architectural detail that stopped Jihan mid-stride despite everything. The threshold. Someone had designed the entrance with extraordinary intentionality. The doors were framed by a subtle recessed archway in natural stone, with a transitional step down that forced anyone entering to pause, to consciously choose to cross. It was a design choice Jihan recognized from traditional Korean architecture, the concept of the daemon, the great gate that marked the boundary between public world and private sanctuary. An architect had built this entrance, a thoughtful one. He heard footsteps rounding the corner behind him. Jihan crossed the threshold. Before we move further, I need to be honest with you. My heart sank when I saw that over 90% of you watch my videos but haven't subscribed yet. Please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free and helps me keep bringing you these amazing stories. The interior stopped him more completely than the exterior had. He stood dripping on a floor of honed black granite, breathing hard, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The space was expansive but intimate, a contradiction he'd spent years trying to achieve in his own work and rarely fully succeeded at. Dark oak paneling rose to double-height ceilings. Lighting came from recessed sources he couldn't immediately locate, creating a warmth that felt earned rather than imposed. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, its contents a deliberate mix of architecture volumes, Korean literature, and what appeared to be medical texts. The furniture was serious and expensive, and arranged with the specific intention of making people feel simultaneously comfortable and aware that they were guests. 3 men sat in the central seating area. They had the particular stillness of people who were never surprised by anything. All 3 of them were looking at Jihan. He was suddenly, brutally aware of how he must appear, soaked through. A bruise along his collarbone from 3 days ago when Seongmin's head of security had caught him in the stairwell of their apartment building before he'd managed to slip away. His suppressant patch visibly failing, he could feel the heat rising in his face, the particular flush that no Omega wanted a room full of strangers to witness. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice coming out steadier than he deserved. Someone is following me, I just need a moment." Two of the men exchanged glances, the third didn't look at them at all. He was sitting slightly apart from the other two, in a chair positioned with its back to the corner, the defensive seating choice of someone who'd learned not to leave their back exposed. He was younger than Jihan had expected from the space's atmosphere, late 20s, perhaps 30, black turtleneck, dark slacks with the particular cut that came from bespoke tailoring rather than luxury retail. His hands, resting on the chair's arms, were elegant and precise-looking, the hands of someone who worked with them in ways that required exactitude. And his eyes, dark and absolutely steady, were already calculating something. "You're from outside Seoul," he said, not a question. Jihan blinked, abusin. "You've been running for more than tonight," also not a question. "The bruise is 3 days old, you're traveling light, no bag, dead phone by the way your hand keeps moving toward your pocket and finding nothing, emergency suppressant patch that's been overworked." He tilted his head slightly. "Interior designer, your eyes went to the bookshelf before they went to the exits." The doors behind Jihan opened. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could hear Seongmin's head of security, a man named Baek Junseo, who Jihan had once thought was simply Seongmin's assistant, until he understood what his actual function was, breathing with the controlled rhythm of a man who ran 5 kilometers every morning and considered violence a professional skill. "I apologize for the intrusion." Baek's voice was professionally smooth. "I'm here to collect someone who left without permission." The seated man hadn't moved, but something in the air of the room had changed, a quality shift, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "Permission," the man said softly, as if tasting the word. "Interesting framing." "It's a private matter." Baek moved closer to Jihan. "Jihan SSI, it's time to come back." "He came here," the seated man said. His voice carried no particular volume, and yet it filled the room completely, which makes this establishment relevant to his situation. He rose from his chair in a single movement, and Jihan registered two things simultaneously: that he was taller than expected, and that the way he moved suggested he'd spent considerable time learning how to make his body a precise instrument. "My name is Han Tiju, this is my building." He looked at Beek with an expression that was entirely polite and entirely without warmth. "You're in it without an invitation. I'd suggest reconsidering your next sentence carefully." Beek's composure cracked barely at the name. Jihan didn't know why, he filed it away. "My employer will want to speak with you directly," Beek said, adjusting his approach with professional smoothness. "Ryu Seongmin." "I know who Ryu Seongmin is." Han Tiju moved to stand beside Jihan, not touching, but positioning himself with precise deliberateness in the architecture of the confrontation. "And you can tell him that anyone who enters this building under my protection stays under it until they choose otherwise." His dark eyes moved to Jihan's face for just a moment, asking rather than assuming, "Is that accurate?" Jihan's throat was tight. He'd stopped trusting alphas 18 months ago. He'd stopped trusting anyone who offered anything that sounded like safety, because safety had a way of becoming a smaller and smaller cage. But the room had been designed by someone who understood thresholds, and this man had said until they choose otherwise. "Yes," Jihan said, "that's accurate." Beek left. The silence that followed had texture to it, a collective exhaling, a recalibration. One of the other two men disappeared quietly through a side door. The remaining one, older, with the compact efficiency of someone who'd spent decades making himself useful in dangerous situations, moved to the periphery of the room with the tact of someone giving space while remaining available. Han Tiju turned to face Jihan fully. This close, the alpha scent was unavoidable, clean and complex, like cold stone and ink, and something that reminded Jihan inexplicably of winter mornings in his grandmother's house in Jeonju. Nothing like Seongmin's aggressive, performative projection. This was simply present, unhurried, making no demands. "You need medical attention, food, and a room with a lock that works from the inside," Han Tiju said. "In that order, do you have objections to any of those?" Jihan studied him. "Why?" "Because you came in here and I let you stay." Something shifted slightly in the careful architecture of his expression. "That creates responsibility, I don't take those lightly." "That's not an answer." Han Tiju looked at him for a long moment with those measuring eyes. "No," he said, "it's not. The full answer is longer and you're exhausted and it'll keep until morning." He gestured toward the older man at the room's edge. "This is Nam Gilsu. He's been with me for 11 years and he will show you to a room. Tomorrow, if you want answers, I'll give them." "And if I want to leave tonight?" "Nam Gilsu will arrange a car and a hotel under a name Ryu Seongmin can't trace." Han Tiju held his gaze. "The choice is yours, Seo Jihan. It will always be yours here." The heat under Jihan's skin pulsed, warning, insistent, his body making its own arguments. He thought about the entrance, the threshold, the deliberate pause built into the architecture. Someone who understood that crossing a boundary should be a choice had built this place. "The room," he said, "for tonight." Nam Gilsu nodded, already moving. This way, please. As Jihan followed, he heard Han Tiju's voice behind him, quiet and directed at the remaining man. Find out everything about Ryu Xiangmin's current legal exposure, everything tonight. The room was on the fourth floor, and it was nothing like what Jihan had expected. He'd half anticipated clinical efficiency, a guest room maintained for utility rather than comfort, the spatial equivalent of a firm handshake. What he found instead was a space that felt considered warm neutrals, natural linen, a worktable positioned at the window with a view of Seoul's nighttime geometry, the kind of view a designer would choose. Bookshelves built into the alcove beside the bed, not decorative but genuinely stocked. On the bedside table, a glass of water, a small meal covered to keep warm, and a sealed package of prescription-grade suppressant patches with a handwritten note. These were sourced from the building's medical supply, dosage chart on the back if you need different strength knock. No name, but the handwriting was precise and slightly architectural, the penmanship of someone who drew plans. Jihan stood in the center of the room for a long time. Then he found the door lock, tested it twice, watched it engage fully under his own hand, and sat down on the edge of the bed with the specific feeling of someone who has been running for so long that stopping feels structurally unsound. He pressed a new suppressant patch to his wrist. He ate the food, which turned out to be sunjubu jjigae at exactly the right temperature and seasoning, the kind of flavors that meant someone had considered that he might be from somewhere specific and cooked accordingly. Then for the first time in 3 days, Seo Jihan slept without listening for footsteps. Morning came through the windows like a quiet argument. Jihan lay still for several minutes after waking, conducting the specific inventory that had become habit over the past 8 months, cataloging exits, sounds, the particular quality of silence that either meant safety or its convincing imitation. The room held morning light with unusual gentleness. Something about the window orientation, northeast facing, catching early sun without the aggressive brightness that turned waking into an assault. Whoever had designed this building understood light. He sat up slowly. The suppressant patch had done its work, the crawling heat beneath his skin had retreated to a manageable simmer, the kind of background awareness he could function around rather than the overwhelming tide that had threatened to pull him under last night. He had perhaps 4 days before his next cycle, possibly 5 if he was careful, if he kept stress low and sleep consistent. Both of those conditions felt optimistic given his current circumstances. His clothes from last night were unwearable, still damp at the seams, carrying the particular smell of fear and rain-soaked concrete that he had no interest in wearing on his skin another hour. On the chair beside the work table, someone had left a folded set of clothing. Simple, well-made, dark trousers, a charcoal Henley, a heavier overshirt in navy, nothing ostentatious. They were close enough to his size to be unsettling in their accuracy. He found a note beneath them. Approximate measurements from last night. If wrong, the second drawer has alternatives. Breakfast is available whenever you're ready, no obligation on timing. The door at the end of the hall leads to a small dining room. If you prefer to eat alone, the phone on the table connects to the kitchen directly. NG. Nam Gilsu, presumably, the older man with the economical movements and the careful eyes. Jihan dressed, stood at the window for a moment looking at Seoul arranging itself in morning light below and made a decision. He would go to the dining room. He would meet Han Tiju in daylight without the adrenaline and failing suppressants distorting his perceptions, and he would determine whether last night's instincts had been accurate or desperately wishful thinking. He'd trusted his instincts about Xiangmin once. The memory of how that had ended made him treat his own judgment like a crime scene, worth examining carefully before drawing conclusions. The dining room was smaller than he'd expected given the scale of the building's other spaces. Intimate was the word, a round table positioned near a window, 4 chairs arranged without hierarchy, morning light coming through sheer curtains that diffused rather than blocked. Hantiju was already seated with coffee and what appeared to be building schematics spread across the table's far half. He'd exchanged last night's turtleneck for a similar one in dark gray, sleeves pushed to his forearms. Reading glasses, thin-framed, architectural in their simplicity, sat slightly down his nose as he studied a document. He looked less like a dangerous underworld figure and more like someone who'd started working before the rest of the building had fully woken up. He noticed Jihan in the doorway without looking up. Coffee or tea, both are on the counter, sit wherever you want. Jihan chose coffee, chose the seat with a clear sightline to the door, and sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. Han Tiju turned a page of his schematics. Jihan drank his coffee and studied the room's proportions. Good ceiling height. The window placement created a natural cross-ventilation pathway that would make the space comfortable in summer without air conditioning. You're reading the room, Han Tiju observed. Habit. Good habit. He removed his glasses, set them on the schematics, and looked at Jihan directly with the full weight of those dark, measuring eyes. In morning light, the sharpness of his face was more apparent, high cheekbones, a jaw that suggested stubbornness, a mouth that held its expressions carefully as if they were resources to be allocated strategically. How are you feeling? Better, Jihan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. You said last night you'd give full answers in the morning. I did. Then tell me why you intervened. You know who Xiangmin is? I could see it in your face when his man said the name, which means you also know what kind of problem keeping me here creates for you. Han Tiju was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone gathering a performance, but of someone deciding how much of something true to put into words. Ryu Xiangmin and I have intersecting business interests, he said finally. Several of them contentious. He's been looking for leverage over me for approximately 8 months. He picked up his coffee. Last night he sent a man into my building to retrieve property, except that you're not property and my building is my territory, and the combination of those two things made his move an overreach I'm not inclined to ignore. So I'm useful to you, Jihan said. The bitterness came out cleaner than he intended, as a countermove. Partially, Han Tiju's gaze didn't waver. But that's not complete. You came through my entrance and asked for sanctuary. I built that entrance to mean something. A pause, brief but genuine. I don't make design choices that don't hold. Jihan stared at him. You designed this building. The entrance and the top 3 floors, I had professional help with the rest. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its architectural suggestion. You noticed the threshold detail. It stopped me mid-sprint with someone behind me. Jihan set his cup down. The demon reference is exact. The recessed arch proportion is traditional, but the material choice is contemporary. It's a considered synthesis, not a pastiche. He paused. Most architects who attempt that kind of integration get the proportions wrong, too much nostalgia or too much irony. Han Tiju looked at him with an expression that was new, a kind of alert, focused attention that was different from the calculating assessment of the night before. You know traditional Korean architectural theory. I work with it, or I did. The past tense landed with its full weight. Seongmin didn't approve of the direction my practice was taking. He thought the Hanok integration work was too regional, too small in ambition. Jihan's jaw tightened. He had opinions about what I should be building. He was wrong. The statement was flat and factual. The synthesis in your work, the Meridian Studio projects, the Hedong Cultural Pavilion in particular, that's not regional. That's a distinct architectural language. Jihan went still. You know my work. I know the work of anyone relevant to my interests. Han Tiju held his gaze. You've been relevant to my interests for a while before last night. The admission landed strangely, not threatening, but requiring careful handling. What does that mean? It means I have a project. Han Tiju turned the schematics around on the table, sliding them toward Jihan. A rehabilitation of a former industrial building in Mapogu. I want it to function as a mixed-use complex, private offices on the upper levels, a public cultural center on the lower 3 floors including gallery space, a performance area, and public gardens. I've had 3 architecture firms present concepts. All 3 gave me glass and steel corporate minimalism with a rooftop garden and called it visionary. Jihan looked at the schematics despite himself. The building's bones were immediately interesting, a 1970s industrial structure with good proportions and the kind of honest materiality that contemporary architecture spent enormous sums trying to fake. Exposed concrete, original steel columns with genuine character, a central atrium that the previous firms had predictably glassed over entirely. You want to keep the atrium open, Jihan said. I want the building to breathe, Han Tiju said. I don't know exactly what that means architecturally. That's what I need a designer for. Jihan pulled the schematics closer. The first firm's proposal was clipped to the front. He flipped past it without much interest, already seeing the glass box solution telegraphing itself in the floor plan. The atrium should be semi-open, retractable covering for weather, but the default is sky. He turned to the building's section drawing. These columns are the whole story. You don't encase them. You organize the entire spatial sequence around them. They're your rhythm, your meter. Everything else is the melody. He looked up and found Han Tiju watching him with that same focused attention. There it is, the alpha said quietly. What? The version of you that exists when no one's telling you to be smaller. Han Tiju's voice was careful, almost deliberate, like he was placing something fragile on a surface. It happens fast, you forget to be afraid. Jihan felt the warmth rise in his face. Not the heat, something else more complicated. He pulled his hands back from the schematics. You're trying to offer me something. Yes, employment. Among other things, legal resources. I have 3 attorneys who specialize in Omega rights law and bond disputes, a place to stay with security that Ryu Xiangmin cannot breach, and time to rebuild what he took from you. Han Tiju folded his hands on the table with the precision of someone accustomed to making offers that changed the terms of situations. In exchange, you design the Mapogu complex, full creative authority. No one overrides your decisions on the build. Full creative authority, Jihan repeated slowly. Your vision, my resources, a building that actually becomes what it should be. Xiangmin had always had opinions about Jihan's designs. Gentle ones at first, suggestions, he'd called them. The client might prefer something more conventional, Jihan. You don't want to alienate people who could help your career. By the end, Jihan had been producing work he didn't recognize as his own, technically competent and utterly hollow, watching his architectural language flat into something acceptable and forgettable. He looked at the schematics again, at those original columns, waiting. There's something wrong with this offer, he said. Probably several things specify. Powerful alphas don't give creative autonomy, they give the appearance of it. He met Han Tiju's gaze directly. Xiangmin told me I had creative freedom too in the beginning. The silence that followed was neither defensive nor dismissive. Han Tiju simply held the observation with what appeared to be genuine consideration. That's accurate, he said finally. I can't offer you proof that I'm different. You'd be right not to take my word for it. He paused. What I can offer is this: every agreement between us in writing, reviewed by an attorney of your choosing, not mine, every design decision documented with your authority recorded, a termination clause you can invoke for any reason with 48 hours notice, and a full severance that covers 6 months of living expenses. His dark eyes were steady. If I override a design decision without documented agreement from you, the project transfers to your name entirely. Jihan blinked. That's an absurd level of risk for you to take. I know the quality of your work, it's not a risk. Han Tiju picked up his coffee, and it's the only offer I know how to make in good conscience. From the doorway, Nam Gilsu appeared silently with a fresh pot of coffee and the specific neutral expression of a man who had learned to be professionally invisible. He refilled both cups without comment and retreated. Jihan looked at the schematics, at Seoul visible through the window, gray and enormous and full of a life he'd lost access to. I'm not making this decision today, he said. I'm not asking you to. I need to speak with an attorney independently. Nam Gilsu will arrange it this afternoon. Lawyer of your choosing, private meeting, no one from my organization present. Jihan studied his face, the careful architecture of it, the sharp angles containing something more complicated underneath, the controlled expressions that occasionally showed their edges like structural steel glimpsed through finished walls. Why does this building have medical texts on the bookshelf? He asked. The question surprised Han Tiju visibly, a fractional shift in his expression that was more interesting than anything else had been. I studied medicine for 2 years before I left university. Why did you leave? A pause longer than the others. Family circumstances made it necessary. He turned his coffee cup on its saucer once, a small, perhaps unconscious movement. I would have been a reconstructive surgeon. Jihan thought about the threshold, the considered synthesis of old and new in the entrance design, the suppressant patches with dosage information, the food that had been seasoned for someone from Busan. He thought about a man who designed spaces to mean something and then built dangerous walls around them. Show me the site, he said. The Mapogu building. Before I decide anything, I want to walk the actual space. Han Tiju set down his cup. When? This morning, now if you can arrange it. For the first time, the suggestion of a smile became briefly actual, there and gone like light through Hanji paper. I can arrange it. Now please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and I wanted to ask you about past commit and commit section. I am promising you I will read every single commit and try to reply to it. And while you're here, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this video? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and can't wait to see how you react to these unbelievable moments. The building was extraordinary. Jihan stood in the center of the main atrium and turned slowly, reading the space the way he read all spaces, as a sequence of decisions made by people over time, a physical record of intention and compromise, and the occasional moment of genuine vision. The concrete walls held the specific warmth of mid-century poured work, imperfect and honest. The steel columns rose in a rhythm that was almost musical, spacing that felt intuitive rather than calculated. Light fell from clear-story windows high in the walls, pooling on the raw concrete floor in geometric patterns that shifted as clouds moved outside. The previous firms wanted to resurface the concrete, Han Tiju said beside him. He'd been largely quiet since they'd arrived, watching Jihan work through the space rather than directing the visit. That would be a crime. Jihan crouched and ran his palm along the floor's surface. This is gyunanmul, traditional Korean poured concrete technique. You can't replicate this texture artificially, believe me, 3 generations of architects have tried. He stood. The floor stays exactly as it is, sealed, not resurfaced. The clients for the cultural center will want the gallery space to feel contemporary. Contemporary and new are different things. The best contemporary spaces know what they're in conversation with. Jihan moved toward one of the columns, measuring his arm span against it instinctively. You put the gallery here, floor to ceiling. You use the column rhythm as your hanging system, custom tracks that follow the structural grid. The columns aren't obstacles, they're the curatorial structure. He turned. And this central atrium, this is your public garden, but vertical. You go up, not out, suspended planters, climbing species that work with the light patterns. In summer, when the retractable roof opens, this space will be. He stopped. Han Tiju was watching him with an expression Jihan hadn't seen on his face before. Open, in a way the careful angles usually didn't allow, absorbing rather than assessing. Continue, Han Tiju said quietly. I'm not giving you the design presentation yet. I haven't decided to take the project. I know, but you were somewhere else just then, a pause, somewhere better. The honesty of it was disarming. Jihan looked away, back up at the clear story light. He used to interrupt, he said, not fully meaning to. Seongmin in the middle of a concept, always with a reason that sounded constructive, practical considerations, Jihana, client expectations, but the timing was always when I just found the thread, he could sense it. He kept his voice level. I think he found it threatening that I had somewhere to go that he couldn't follow. Han Tiju said nothing, but his silence had a quality of listening that was its own response. This building should stay, Jihan said finally, looking back at the atrium. Everything that was here before, you build around it, not over it. The new work should be in conversation with the old, not trying to replace it. That's a philosophy as much as an approach, Han Tiju observed. Good architecture usually is. They stood in the column-filtered light for another moment, the building holding them both in its generous, patient space. I'll look at the contract, Jihan said. Han Tiju nodded once, careful not to let the concession become a victory. But Jihan saw the quality of stillness in him, the controlled breathing of someone who is working very hard not to show relief. He filed that away too. Back at the building that evening, Nam Gilsu appeared at Jihan's door with a folder. Attorney's contact details, he said, handing it over. She specializes in Omega rights, bond invalidation, and civil litigation. She's not affiliated with us. She actually took a case against one of TJUSC's businesses 3 years ago and won. He paused. Her number is at the top. Jihan stared at the folder. He told you to find someone who'd worked against him. He told me to find someone you could trust. Nam Gilsu's expression didn't change, but something in it was quietly significant. Those aren't always the same thing. In this case, they were. After he left, Jihan sat at the work table, the folder open, his eyes on the attorney's name and number. Then he pulled a sketchbook from the table drawer, blank, expensive paper, the kind that waited for something worth committing to, and began to draw the Mapogu atrium from memory. The columns first, always the structure first. Then the light. 2 weeks into his stay, Jihan learned that Han Tiju didn't sleep enough. He discovered this at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when insomnia drove him to the building's small kitchen on the 3rd floor. The one Nam Gilsu had shown him was accessible to residents at any hour, and he found Han Tiju already there, standing at the counter with a cup of tea gone cold beside him, reading a document with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't noticed the hours passing. Jihan stopped in the doorway. Han Tiju looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment in the specific way of people encountered outside their expected contexts, each recalibrating. Tea, Han Tiju said finally, gesturing toward the counter, or there's barley water in the second shelf if you prefer something cold. Jihan made tea, sat at the kitchen table because leaving felt unnecessarily pointed. Han Tiju returned to his document, but the quality of the room had shifted, less solitary now, 2 people occupying the same quiet rather than each occupying their own. You do this often, Jihan said after a while, not a question. Often enough, Han Tiju turned a page. Sleep became a negotiable variable some years ago. When you took over the business. A pause. Before that, medical school runs on the premise that human bodies don't require the things they actually require. He set the document down. I never fully reversed the conditioning. Jihan wrapped both hands around his cup. In the kitchen's modest light, Han Tiju looked younger than he did in the building's more formal spaces, less architected, the careful arrangement of his expressions somewhat relaxed by the hour. There was something around his eyes that might have been tiredness or might have been something older than tiredness. What are you reading? Jihan asked. Quarterly security assessments, he paused fractionally, and Ryu Seongmin's financial disclosure records. Jihan's hands tightened on the cup. We don't have to discuss it tonight, Han Tiju said, watching him. What did you find? Another pause, the kind where Jihan was beginning to recognize that Han Tiju was deciding not what to say but how much of something true to commit to words. His practice is in more difficulty than he's made public. 3 major clients terminated contracts in the past 6 months. There's a tax investigation that hasn't been formally announced. And his bonding documentation, he stopped. Tell me. Attorney O is reviewing everything, Han Tiju said carefully. She'll walk you through the details tomorrow. I don't want to give you incomplete information on something this significant. You're protecting me from a bad night's sleep. I'm ensuring you hear it with proper legal context so it doesn't just feel like damage and instead feels like leverage. He picked up his cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. There's a difference. Jihan studied him, the precision of the distinction, not softening the information but reframing when it landed, so it arrived as power rather than pain. It was a thoughtful cruelty in reverse. You think strategically about everything, Jihan said. Occupational requirements. Even this, he gestured slightly at the kitchen, the hour, the accidental companionship. You're strategic about how you manage people around you. Han Tiju looked at him steadily. I'm careful, he said. There's a difference between that and strategic. Something shifted in his expression, a rare unlocking. Strategic implies I'm always working toward a predetermined outcome. Careful means I'm paying attention to what's actually in front of me. He paused. What's in front of me is someone who's been handled badly by people who were definitely strategic. I'd rather be careful. The kitchen held its nighttime quiet around them. Jihan didn't have an answer for that, so he drank his tea and didn't try to manufacture one. Comfortable silence, he was discovering, was one of Han Tiju's stranger qualities. The man could occupy shared space without filling it, without the anxious performance of presence that Seongmin had always required. Say something? Why are you always so quiet? You're being distant again, Jihana. The atrium design, Jihan said eventually. I've been working through the vertical garden system. I want to use Korean native climbing species Ampelopsis, Wisteria floribunda, some Celestris for autumn color. But the irrigation infrastructure needs to be completely concealed within the column structure. I need to know if the original steel can be retrofitted or if we're building new columns inside the existing ones. Hantiju blinked at the shift in conversational territory, then something in him settled, recognizing safe ground. The structural engineer's assessment is in the project folder, third tab. He flagged the northeast columns as potentially requiring reinforcement, but the southwest array should accommodate retrofit work. I need to see the original construction documents, not the firm's digitized versions, the actual original blueprints from the 1970s. The digitization process loses information. Nam Gilsu can request them from the city archives tomorrow. And I need material samples. I've been drawing the Hanji screen installation for the upper office corridor, but I want to test 3 different papermakers' work before I specify. The weight and translucency varies significantly between. Jihan SSI, Han Tiju's voice was quiet, but it interrupted the momentum gently. It's 2 in the morning. Jihan stopped, looked at the table. I do this, he said, with the particular flatness of self-recognition. When I'm anxious about something I can't control, I redirect into work I can. I know I do the same thing. Hantiju gestured at his security assessments. It's not a flaw, it's a coping mechanism with genuinely productive side effects. The edge of his mouth shifted. The Hanji specification can wait until morning. The anxiety that's driving it won't actually be resolved by making design decisions at 2 a.m. What will resolve it? Probably Attorney O's meeting tomorrow, and time, he paused. And the knowledge that whatever Ryu Seongmin is planning, he's planning it into a wall I've spent 2 weeks making sure is solid. Jihan looked up at that. You've been building something. I've been dismantling something, Han Tiju corrected. His leverage, his resources, the legal infrastructure he built to keep you trapped. His voice was matter-of-fact, like discussing a construction timeline. It takes time, but walls come down the same way they go up, one load-bearing element at a time. The phrase landed with its full weight. Jihan thought about the year he'd spent inside Seongmin's architecture of control, how it had seemed seamless and total, how escaping one constraint had revealed 3 more beneath it. The isolation first, then the financial dependency, then the legal documentation, each layer revealed only once you'd broken through the one above it. How many layers does he have? Jihan said quietly. Fewer than he thinks. Han Tiju's eyes were calm, precise, and fewer every day. Attorney Oh Soo-yeon was exactly the kind of woman who made rooms feel smaller by the quality of her attention. She arrived at 11 the next morning with a briefcase that Jihan suspected contained more thoroughly organized documentation than most people produced in a lifetime. And she sat across from him in the small meeting room Nam Gilsu had prepared, just the 2 of them as promised, and laid out the landscape of Jihan's situation with the specific compassion of someone who understood that accurate information, delivered clearly, was more respectful than cushioned approximations. The bonding documentation was fraudulent, not ambiguously irregular, fraudulent. 2 of the 3 witness signatures were provably fabricated. The consent waiver bore Jihan's signature in a context that, cross-referenced with his medical records from that period, corresponded to a hospitalization during which he'd been sedated. You were unconscious, Attorney O said simply, and watched Jihan receive that. He'd suspected, he'd reconstructed the timeline during the long trapped months and felt the shape of it, the gaps in his memory, the bond that had felt imposed rather than chosen, Seongmin's strange certainty that couldn't have come from anything Jihan had genuinely agreed to. But suspicion and legal confirmation were architecturally different things. One was a structural instability you worked around. The other was a foundation assessment that told you the building could stand. How long to invalidate it, Jihan said. The fraudulent consent makes this faster than standard bond disputes. 6 to 8 weeks for the formal invalidation. However, she opened a second section of her documentation. There are complicating factors. Ryu Seongmin has filed a preemptive civil suit claiming abandonment and property destruction. The property destruction claim is based on alleged damage to his Busan studio, which my investigator has already established is entirely fabricated. The abandonment claim is more complex because of the fraudulent bond. If the bond is invalid, abandonment has no legal standing, but he's betting on a delay strategy. He wants to drag it out. He wants to create enough legal noise that you feel overwhelmed and return rather than fight. Attorney O's expression held professional contempt. It's a common tactic. It works on people who don't have adequate resources. She closed the second folder and looked at Jihan directly. You have adequate resources. Han Tiju's resources. Yours for the duration of this case, structured as a legal aid arrangement with no repayment obligation. I reviewed the documentation Mr. Han provided. It's clean, no conditions, no debt structure, no claim on future earnings. It's a gift, legally speaking. She paused. In my experience, that's unusual. Jihan said nothing. I'm not asking you to trust him, she continued. I'm asking you to trust the documentation which I have reviewed independently. The rest is your judgment to make. After she left, Jihan sat in the meeting room for a long time with the folder open on the table, reading the fraudulent consent waiver. The signature that was his and wasn't his, given in a context of unconsciousness, used to build walls around a year of his life. He thought about the rooftop that Han Tiju had mentioned in passing, the late-night kitchen, the cold tea and the security assessments, and the careful distinction between strategic and careful. He thought about the Mapogu building and its waiting columns. He picked up his sketchbook and began to draw. The rhythm of the following days established itself with the organic logic of good spatial planning, each element finding its natural position relative to the others, the whole becoming coherent without being forced. Mornings, Jihan worked in the project room on the second floor that Nam Gilsu had converted into a design studio, surfaces large enough for full-scale drawings, natural light from a north-facing window that stayed consistent through the day. He produced work with a focused velocity he hadn't felt in over a year, ideas arriving faster than his hands could fully capture them. Afternoons, frequently the site. Han Tiju joined him twice a week, and Jihan found himself structuring those visits differently from his solo ones, less pure spatial absorption, more conversation, the design thinking made audible in ways that clarified his own reasoning. Evenings, variable, sometimes solitary in his room with the sketchbooks, sometimes the kitchen at a reasonable hour where Han Tiju would appear with the reliability of someone who had identified a good reason to be somewhere and acted on it without making a performance of the decision. They talked about architecture with the sustained intensity of two people who had both, in different ways, spent years not being able to say everything they thought. Han Tiju's knowledge was self-taught, systematic, the kind built by someone who'd identified a gap in their understanding and addressed it with methodical determination. He'd read widely, theory, history, engineering, but he was honest about where his knowledge ended and consistently more interested in Jihan's reasoning than in demonstrating his own. That honesty was disarming in a way Jihan kept having to recalibrate around. Xiangmin had always needed to know more. In every conversation, in every room, the implicit requirement that his alpha know most and speak last. The subtle corrections to Jihan's assessments that were less about accuracy and more about the maintenance of a particular architecture of authority. Han Tiju asked questions with the genuine intent of receiving the answers. The threshold sequence in traditional Korean domestic architecture, he said one afternoon at the site, standing at the building's main entrance while Jihan measured proportions. You've referenced it several times in the design documents. Walk me through the theory. Jihan set down his measuring tape. Traditional Korean homes were organized around a series of progressive thresholds: Daemun outer gate, Yongmun inner gate, Sarangmun the family gate. Each crossing marked a transition in context, in relationship, and expectation. He moved to stand in the entrance. You couldn't go from public street to private family space in a single step. Each threshold forced a pause, a reorientation. You always knew exactly where you were and what the space asked of you. And contemporary architecture abandoned that. Contemporary architecture prioritized flow, which has its own value, but we lost the pause, we lost the threshold as a meaningful moment. He looked at the building's entrance frame. I want to restore that here, not literally, not historical reproduction, but spatially. Someone coming in off the street should feel the sequence. Public, semi-public, the gathering space, the private levels, each transition marked deliberately. Han Tiju was quiet for a moment. My entrance, he said, the one at the main building you identified at the night you arrived. It stopped me mid-sprint, Jihan said. The recessed arch, the step down, the change in material underfoot, you built a pause into it. I'd been running for 3 days and the architecture made me stop and choose. He paused. That's what good thresholds do. They don't prevent crossing, they make the crossing deliberate. Han Tiju looked at him for a long, still moment. I designed it during a period when I was thinking about what protection actually means, he said quietly. Whether it should be a wall or a choice. He glanced at the entrance frame. I think I decided it should be a choice, but I'm not sure I fully understood what I was deciding until just now. The afternoon light shifted through the clear-story windows, moving the column shadows across the floor in slow geometry. Why did you leave medical school? Jihan asked. The question had been sitting in him for days, waiting for a moment with the right quality of openness. A long pause, Han Tiju moved to one of the columns, rested his hand flat against the steel. My father ran an organization that operated outside certain legal frameworks, he said with the precise neutrality of someone who has found the accurate language for a complicated truth. When I was 23, he was killed by a rival faction that believed his death would allow them to absorb his territory. He was quiet for a moment. They were wrong about that, but they were right that it ended something. His hand moved slightly on the column. I had a younger brother, 16 at the time, and approximately 40 people whose livelihoods, and in some cases physical safety, depended on the organization continuing to function. So you came back. I came back, and the people who had killed my father discovered that grief, when properly organized, becomes something with edges. His jaw tightened slightly. I spent the first 2 years being frankly dangerous in ways I'm not proud of. The following years building something more durable, something that could protect the people under it without requiring me to be only dangerous. You built structure around it. I tried to, he looked at Jihan. I don't pretend it's clean. The business I run now operates in spaces that legitimate structures don't reach. There are things I've ordered that I don't discuss at kitchen tables at 2 a.m. A pause. I'm telling you this because you deserve an accurate understanding of what kind of protection I'm offering. I'm not a clean alternative to Ryu Seongmin. I'm a different kind of complicated. Jihan held his gaze. Seongmin presented himself as clean, successful architect, respected professional, legitimate in every visible way. He paused. He wasn't. The legitimacy was the cage. He looked around the atrium. You're telling me about your edges before I've asked. That's different. I'm also telling you, Han Tiju continued carefully, because I'm aware that I'm attracted to you and that you have every reason to be skeptical of an alpha in my position making that known, and that I would rather you have complete information and make whatever choice you make from accurate understanding than have you feel ambushed later. The statement arrived with the blunt precision of a structural assessment. No performance, no manipulation of atmosphere, just the fact of it placed clearly on the table between them. Jahan's breath had stopped briefly. He restarted it deliberately. That's a very architectural way to declare an interest, he said carefully. I'm a careful person, Han Tiju said, and this time there was something at the corner of his mouth that was unambiguously a smile, small, slightly self-aware, they're long enough to be real, and you're someone I find worth being careful around. Jihan looked at the columns, at the light, at the building that was slowly, in his sketchbooks and his measurements and his late-night drawing sessions, becoming something it had been waiting to become. I need time, he said. I know. Not because he stopped, started again. The issue isn't whether I'm attracted to you. The issue is that I spent 18 months having my own judgment used against me and I don't fully trust it yet. He turned to face Hantiju directly. I need to trust my own reading of a situation before I act on it. Hantiju nodded, no pressure visible, no performance of acceptance covering actual disappointment, just a real acknowledgement, clean and complete. Then we continue as we are, he said, and you take whatever time that requires. You're not going to tell me you can wait forever, Jihan said, the way people say things like that. No, I'm going to tell you that I have substantial work to occupy my attention while you determine whether your instincts about this situation are accurate. A pause. And that I think they are, but that's for you to establish, not me. They left the building as the afternoon light began its long descent toward evening, and on the drive back through Seoul's traffic, Jihan sat with the specific feeling of someone who has found a load-bearing wall and is carefully, precisely testing whether it holds. That night, he added new elements to the atrium drawings. The thresholds between levels, each one marked, each one deliberate, each crossing a choice rather than a flow. He worked until the sketchbook pages ran out of space and he had to start a second one. Outside, Seoul moved through its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere in the building Han Tiju was probably reading security assessments with cold tea. Jihan found the thought settling rather than unsettling. He turned to a fresh page and kept drawing. The attack came on a Wednesday, which felt wrong somehow. Jihan had always associated Wednesdays with the particular productive momentum of a week finding its stride, the administrative weight of Monday resolved, the anticipatory distraction of Friday still distant. In his Busan studio, Wednesdays had been his best designed days. Deep work, uninterrupted, the week's middle holding him steady on both sides. This Wednesday arrived with Nam Gilsu at his studio door at 7 a.m. wearing an expression that had abandoned its usual careful neutrality. We have a situation, he said. TJUSSI needs you to stay in your room until further notice. Jihan set down his pencil. What kind of situation? The kind where Ryu Seongmin has retained a private intelligence firm and filed emergency injunctive relief in 3 separate courts simultaneously. Nam Gilsu's voice was professionally controlled, but his eyes were doing something complicated. He's also contacted your family in Busan. The last sentence landed differently from the others. Jihan stood up slowly. My family. Your parents and your younger sister. He told them you'd suffered a psychological break and were being held against your will by a dangerous criminal organization. Nam Gilsu held his gaze. Your sister is currently on a train to Seoul. Everything in Jihan's chest tightened into a specific architectural shape. The sensation of load-bearing walls suddenly required to carry more than their designed capacity. She can't come here, he said immediately. If Seongmin knows she's coming, he'll have someone watching the station. Already handled. Han Tiju's voice came from the hallway. He appeared in the doorway behind Nam Gilsu, dressed and composed in a way that suggested he'd been awake for some time. We have someone meeting her train at Suzio instead of Seoul Station. She'll be brought here through a secondary route. Jihan stared at him. You already knew. 20 minutes ago, I came to tell you myself, but Nam Gilsu was closer. He met Jihan's eyes steadily. Your sister's name is Seo Yoonjung. She's 26, works in textile design, and she called Seongmin's account of events. I'm quoting Nam Gilsu's source here, complete nonsense. Something in Jihan's chest released fractionally. She would. She also apparently told your parents that if you'd wanted to come home, you would have come home, and that their job was to wait and trust you. The edge of Han Tiju's mouth shifted. She sounds formidable. She's the most competent person I know. Jihan realized he was gripping the edge of the work table, consciously released it. The injunctions, what does he want? Emergency custody determination. He's arguing you're an Omega in psychological crisis, that the fraudulent bond was genuine, and that your current residence constitutes unlawful detention. Han Tiju's voice was precise, controlled, the specific tone of someone presenting tactical information stripped of emotional coloring. It's designed to create noise, not to succeed. Attorney O has already been alerted and is preparing counterfilings. He paused. None of it will hold. But it will take the next several days to demonstrate that conclusively, and in the meantime, Seongmin will use the media ambiguity. Media. He's given a statement to two outlets. Concerned Alpha seeking to ensure vulnerable Omega's welfare and safe return. The framing is deliberate. Han Tiju watched Jihan's face carefully. He knows this will reach your professional network before we can fully counter it. Jihan sat back down, not from weakness but from the specific necessity of occupying a stable position while processing structural damage assessments. He thought about his professional network, the architects and clients and collaborators he'd spent years building relationships with, the reputation that had survived Seongmin's controlled isolation mostly because the work itself was undeniable. Vulnerable Omega, psychological crisis, unlawful detention. He's trying to do to my career what he couldn't finish doing to my life, Jihan said. Yes, Han Tiju didn't soften it. He's recognized that the legal strategy is failing and he's moving to reputational damage as a secondary approach. Can we counter it? Effectively, yes, but not immediately. He moved into the room, not taking a seat but positioning himself at the work table's edge, present without crowding. The building project counters it structurally. A signed architectural commission with documented creative authority and legal protections isn't the profile of a detained Omega. Attorney O is preparing a public statement on the bond invalidation proceedings. He looked at Jihan. And you have the right to speak for yourself publicly if you choose to. Your voice in this is more powerful than anything I can say. Jihan considered that. The idea of speaking, of taking up space in his own story rather than being narrated by Seongmin's version of it, felt both necessary and frightening in equal measure. Not yet, he said, when we have more of the legal documentation confirmed. Han Tiju nodded. That's the right timing, I just wanted you to know the option exists. A knock at the studio door, one of the security staff, young, professional, slightly breathless. Sir, Miss Seo's car is 20 minutes out. Seo Yoonjung arrived like weather, with energy that preceded her, with the specific velocity of someone who had spent a 4-hour train journey organizing their response to a situation and was ready to implement it immediately. She was shorter than Jihan by 6 centimeters, with their mother's jaw and their father's eyes, and a capacity for radiating competent concern that had been evident since she was approximately 9 years old, and had organized the neighborhood children's response to a stray dog situation with the efficiency of a logistics coordinator. She walked through the building's entrance, clocked the architecture in approximately 3 seconds with the assessing eye of a designer, turned to Jihan, and hugged him with a force that suggested she'd been holding it in since Suzio Station. You look terrible, she said into his shoulder. Thank you. The bruise on your collarbone is 3 weeks old and you've lost weight. She pulled back and looked at his face with the thoroughness of a structural inspection. You're sleeping though, that's different from 6 months ago. Jihan felt something loosen in him that he hadn't fully identified as tight, the specific relief of being seen by someone who had known him long enough to read him accurately. 6 months ago, you didn't know things were wrong. I knew something was wrong. You stopped talking about your work. Her eyes moved past him to where Han Tiju stood at a careful remove, Nam Gilsu beside him. She assessed them both with the frank evaluation of someone who had decided her concern for her brother overrode conventional social calibration. You're Han Tiju. I am, Han Tiju said. Ryu Seongmin told my parents you were holding my brother against his will in a criminal compound. She tilted her head. This doesn't look like a criminal compound. It looks like an exceptionally well-designed building, Jihan said. It does actually, she turned back to Han Tiju. He's here voluntarily. He arrived voluntarily and he stays voluntarily, Han Tiju said, with full freedom to leave at any point. That's documented. Yoonjung studied him for a moment with the specific quality of attention that suggested she was running calculations. Then she turned back to Jihan. Show me your room. I want to see where you're living. She approved of the room with the measured acknowledgement of someone whose standards had been met, but who wasn't going to be effusive about it. She inspected the lock mechanism with particular attention. Internal priority override, she observed, testing it. He can't enter without my permission, Jihan said. Even in emergencies, it requires my authorization. Yoonjung sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her brother with an expression that was several things simultaneously: relief, residual fear on his behalf, anger that had been carefully redirected into practicality. Tell me everything from the beginning. He told her, all of it: the gradual isolation, the withheld suppressants, the fraudulent bond, the 8 months of planning an escape, the 3 days of running, the parking garage, the entrance with the threshold that had stopped him. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He told Mom you'd had a breakdown, she said, that you'd become delusional, that the trauma of your relationship had destabilized your Omega psychology, that he was worried about your capacity for independent decision-making. Her voice was level, but her hands in her lap had closed into fists. He used the exact clinical language that gets Omega welfare authorities involved. I know, Jihan looked at his hands. That's the legal strategy Attorney O is countering. I know Attorney O, Yoonjung said, which surprised him. She handled a case for a friend of mine 2 years ago. She's exceptional. A pause. Mom and Dad are scared, not because they believe him, they don't, not fully, but because they don't understand what's happening and they miss you, and that combination makes people vulnerable to whichever narrative is loudest. I'll call them today. Call them today and tell them you're safe and that you're working. She looked around the room at the sketchbooks piled on the work table, the drawings pinned to the wall. Are you working? Jihan looked at his drawings. At the Mapogu atrium rendered in careful pencil lines, the columns and the light and the vertical garden system taking shape across 6 sheets of paper. Yes. Good, something in Yoonjung's expression settled. That's the most important thing. When you stopped talking about your work, I knew something fundamental was wrong. You've been an architect since you were 7 years old, drawing floor plans of imaginary houses. She paused. He tried to take that. He nearly did. She stood and crossed to the wall of drawings, studying them with a designer's eye. Her hand moved to trace the atrium section drawing. This is beautiful, the column rhythm. I know. The vertical garden concept with the climbing species. Have you solved the irrigation concealment? Working on it. The northeast columns need structural reinforcement first, and I'm waiting on the original construction documents from the city archives. Yoonjung turned with something like her normal expression restored, the competent, forward-moving CEO Yoonjung who organized things and solved problems, and refused to let situations remain worse than they needed to be. I'm staying for a week. You don't have to. I want to, she looked at him steadily, and I want to meet with Attorney O and understand the legal timeline. And, a fractional pause, I want to spend some time observing Han Tiju. Jihan felt something complicated. He's not on trial. No, but you matter to me, and your judgment about alphas has been not wrong exactly, but operating under conditions that compromised your ability to trust it. She held his gaze with the particular directness of a sibling who has decided honesty is more useful than comfort. I'm not here to make decisions for you. I'm here to give you a second pair of eyes that aren't operating under the same constraints yours have been. He wanted to argue with this and couldn't find the structural integrity to do so. Fine, he said. Yoonjung's observation of Han Tiju took approximately 48 hours, and she conducted it with the transparent methodology of someone who had decided subtlety was less efficient than directness. She joined them at the Mapogu site on Thursday afternoon, walking the building with the attentiveness of someone who understood spatial language. She asked Han Tiju 2 questions about the project, both intelligent, both designed to reveal how he responded to professional challenge, and she watched the way he deferred to Jihan's expertise with the specific attention of someone checking whether the deference was genuine or performed. That evening, she appeared in Han Tiju's office doorway while Jihan was working through structural drawings with him and said, "Can I ask you something direct?" Han Tiju looked up from the drawings. Yes. What do you want from my brother, actually? The silence that followed had a quality of genuine consideration rather than defensive recalibration. Han Tiju set down his pencil. Right now, I want to see him practice architecture without someone standing behind him deciding what it should be, he said. The Mapogu project is genuinely what I represented it as. I need his specific vision and no one else's will produce the same result. He held her gaze. Beyond that, I'd like the opportunity to be someone he might eventually choose to trust, not claim, not bond, choose, a pause. Whether that happens is entirely his determination. Yoonjung studied him for a long moment. He told me about the heat, she said, what you did, what you didn't do. Something in Han Tiju's expression tightened fractionally. That's not, I don't want acknowledgement for meeting a basic standard of decency. I know, that's why I'm acknowledging it. She looked at him steadily. Ryu Seongmin used Jihan's heats as evidence that the bond was consensual, the biology as proof of willingness. Her voice was quiet but precise. The fact that you understand the distinction, that you not only understand it but acted on it under circumstances where most alphas wouldn't, that matters. Han Tiju said nothing, but something in his posture had shifted, a slight unlocking in the careful architecture of his self-containment. I'm not giving you my approval, Yoonjung continued. He doesn't need my approval. He's 31 years old and the most capable person I know when someone isn't actively dismantling his capacity for judgment. She turned to leave, then paused. But I'm not concerned, which for me means something. She left. Jahan realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled carefully. Hantiju looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement if it hadn't been threaded with something considerably more complex. Your sister is. I know. Formidable was an understatement. She organized a neighborhood infrastructure project when she was 12, Jahan said. She's been like this her whole life. Hantiju looked back at the structural drawings. After a moment, she's right though. Jihan looked at him. About what? The distinction, his voice was quiet, between choosing and being claimed, between wanting someone to trust you and expecting trust as a given. He traced the column layout on the drawing without quite touching the pencil line. I grew up in a context where alphas expected certain things, certain deferences, certain access, certain demonstrations of hierarchy that I absorbed so thoroughly I spent years dismantling them from the inside. He paused. I'm still dismantling some of them. I'd rather you know that than discover it later. Jihan looked at him, the sharp profile bent over the drawings, the precise hands, the quality of someone doing difficult interior work with the same methodical honesty they brought to external problems. The northwest column array, Jihan said after a moment. I think we need to reposition the garden installation's starting point. The light modeling I ran yesterday shows the current position creates a shadow block on the second-level gallery in winter afternoons. Hantiju looked up, and this time the smile was complete, unguarded briefly before the careful architecture reasserted itself. Show me, he said. Friday brought the first real escalation. Jihan was in the studio when Nam Gilsu appeared at the door with an expression he'd learned to read as the specific neutrality of bad news being managed. The media story ran, Nam Gilsu said, 3 outlets, one of them ran photographs. Jihan set down his pencil. Of me. Taken from surveillance approximately 4 days ago, leaving the Mapogu site with Tiju SSI, he paused. The framing is the headline uses the phrase missing Omega architect. The phrase settled into Jihan's chest with its full structural weight. Missing, as if he'd been lost rather than freed, as if his presence somewhere Seongmin hadn't chosen constituted an absence that required correction. He stood up. I want to make a statement. Attorney O recommends. I know what she recommends. I'm telling you I'm ready. He looked at Nam Gilsu steadily. Arrange it today. Han Tiju appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, and in his expression, Jihan read something he hadn't seen there before, not concern exactly, but the focused alertness of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation. You're sure, Han Tiju said. He called me missing. Jihan's voice was controlled and completely certain. I'm not missing. I know exactly where I am. He held Han Tiju's gaze, and it's time I said so in my own words. The statement he gave that afternoon, drafted with Attorney O, reviewed by Jihan alone, delivered to a single journalist he'd known professionally for 6 years and trusted for his accuracy, was 11 sentences long. It stated that he had left a relationship involving documented coercion, fraudulent bonding procedures, and sustained psychological abuse. That he was residing voluntarily in Seoul pursuing an architectural commission. That the bond invalidation proceedings were progressing through proper legal channels. That he was not missing, not in crisis, and not in need of intervention from anyone claiming to act in his interests without his request or consent. The 11th sentence read, I am an architect, I am working, and for the first time in 18 months, both of those things are true simultaneously. He didn't mention Hantiju by name, he didn't need to, the work spoke for itself. That evening, Yoonjung read the statement on her phone and said nothing for a full minute. Then that last line. I know, Jihan said. That's the whole story in one sentence. I know. She looked at him with the expression of someone watching a structure that had been under extraordinary load begin to demonstrate that it had been sound all along. You're going to be all right, she said, not as comfort, as structural assessment, as someone who understood load-bearing walls and had just confirmed that his were holding. Yes, Jihan said, and found to his own quiet surprise that he believed it. The statement changed something in the atmosphere of the building. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of obvious shift, no clear before and after. But over the following days, Jihan became aware of a subtle recalibration in how the building's inhabitants moved around him, less careful management of information, less of the considerate but slightly protective quality that Nam Gilsu and the staff had maintained since his arrival, the implicit treatment of him as someone requiring careful handling. He'd spoken for himself, and the space around him had adjusted accordingly. His professional network responded within 48 hours. Messages from former colleagues, from clients he'd worked with before. Seongmin had systematically narrowed his world, from architects whose work he'd admired from a careful distance during the isolation years. Some were simply expressions of support. Several were professional inquiries, people who had seen his name attached to the Mapogu Commission and wanted to discuss future projects. One was from the editorial director of Architecture Korea, the most significant professional journal in his field, asking if he'd be willing to write a piece on traditional and contemporary synthesis for their spring issue. He read that one 3 times. Then he went to find Han Tiju. Han Tiju was on the building's roof. Jihan hadn't been up here before. The access door was on the 5th floor, unmarked, requiring a key card that he now had but hadn't thought to use. He emerged into a space that stopped him with its quality of unexpected intention. It wasn't a conventional rooftop. No HVAC units dominating the space, no utilitarian gravel surface. Someone had built a garden up here, genuine, considered, not decorative. Raised timber beds with a rotation of plants that suggested someone paid attention to what they were growing. A seating area with a low table and 2 chairs positioned to face west, toward the particular quality of Seoul's late afternoon skyline. Along the parapet, a series of small stone figures that Jihan recognized as jangseung, traditional Korean guardian posts, their carved faces worn smooth with age, clearly original rather than reproduced. Han Tiju was standing at the parapet looking at the city with the particular quality of stillness that Jihan had come to recognize as the version of him that existed when he wasn't managing anything. "I didn't know this was up here," Jihan said. Han Tiju turned. He had his sleeves rolled up despite the autumn cool, his hands showing the ink that climbed his forearms. Jihan still hadn't asked about the tattoos, had cataloged them as something to understand later, their designs complex enough to suggest they were a language rather than decoration. "I built it the 2nd year, when I realized I needed somewhere the work couldn't follow me." Jihan moved to stand beside him at the parapet, looking out at Seoul arranging itself in the late light. The city from this height had a different quality than from street level. The density became pattern, the noise became distance, the scale shifted from overwhelming to legible. "The Jangseung," Jihan said, nodding toward the carved figures. "My father collected them, traditional belief that they guard boundaries between settlement and wilderness, between the living and whatever is beyond." Han Tiju's voice was quiet. "He had 6, I have his 6 and 8 more I've found over the years." He glanced at them. "I like the idea that boundaries can have guardians, that crossing a threshold means something is watching over the crossing." Jihan thought about thresholds, about all the ones he'd crossed in the past weeks, the entrance on a rainy night, the decision to stay, the attorney's meeting, the statement. Each one deliberate, each one with the specific quality of a choice made with full awareness of its weight. "The Architecture Korea inquiry," he said. "The editorial director wants a piece on traditional and contemporary synthesis." Han Tiju looked at him. "I heard Nam Gilsu monitors relevant professional correspondence for security purposes." A pause, "with your documented permission." "I know," Jihan had authorized it 2 weeks ago in the comprehensive security briefing, had appreciated that it was presented as a choice rather than a given. "I want to write it, the piece." He looked out at the city. "I want to write about the Mapogu project specifically, the column rhythm, the threshold sequence, the vertical garden. I want to write about the theory behind the integration approach. That would generate significant professional attention for the project before completion," Han Tiju observed. "I know, is that a problem for you?" Han Tiju shook his head. "It's your work, the attention is yours." A pause. "I'd want to review it only for any security-sensitive building details, otherwise it's entirely your decision." Jihan turned to look at him directly. The late light was doing something to Han Tiju's face. The sharp angles softened marginally, the controlled expressions carrying more of their underlying texture. He looked like someone who had built very strong walls a long time ago and occasionally, in specific lights, showed what the walls had been built to protect. "Why does your roof have a garden?" Jihan asked. Han Tiju blinked slightly at the redirection. "My father believed growing things required the same attention as maintaining relationships. Consistent, patient, responsive to what the plant actually needed rather than what you assumed it needed." He moved to one of the raised beds, touched a late-season herb with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "He was better at both than I am, but I keep trying." "What was he like?" The question was direct and Jihan knew it. He'd asked it deliberately, not to cause pain, but because he'd noticed that Han Tiju spoke around his father's memory with careful peripheral movements, referencing him in the context of the garden, the Jangseung, the medical school trajectory, but never directly. A long pause, long enough that Jihan thought he might not answer. "Enormous," Han Tiju said finally. "In the way that people who take up their full space are enormous." He was loud and certain, and he made decisions that were sometimes brutal and always absolute, and he loved extravagantly. Without the carefulness I learned from watching what happened when he didn't have it, his hands stilled on the herb bed. "I inherited the certainty and the brutality. I've spent 15 years trying to add the extravagance." A pause, "with variable success." Jihan thought about the suppressant patches with dosage information. The Sunjabu Jjigi seasoned for someone from Busan. The attorney who had won a case against Han Tiju's business, chosen precisely because she couldn't be suspected of his influence. Less variable than you think, he said quietly. Han Tiju looked at him. The late light, the rooftop garden, the stone guardians at the parapet, something in the quality of the moment had the specific weight of a threshold. I want to show you something, Han Tiju said, if you're willing. He led Jihan back inside and down to the second floor, to a room Jihan had noted but not entered, always closed, no indication of purpose. Han Tiju unlocked it with his key card and stood back to let Jihan enter first. It was a study, or had been. Now it was. Jihan stood in the doorway and tried to find the right word. The walls were covered in architectural drawings. Not prints, not reproductions, originals in varying stages of completion, some on large format paper and some on smaller sheets, some in precise technical line and some in looser conceptual sketches. The style was consistent, the same hand throughout, trained and thoughtful, with a quality of spatial imagination that went beyond technical competence into something that had genuine vision. Han Tiju's drawings. You draw, Jihan said, with the particular tone of someone recalibrating a significant assumption. I studied it seriously for 2 years before medicine. After, Han Tiju moved into the room, looking at the walls with an expression that was complex and slightly unguarded. After I came back and built the organization, there wasn't room for it professionally, but I kept doing it. He paused. This room is where I put the things I can't act on. Jihan moved along the walls slowly, reading the drawings with the professional attention of someone who understood their language. Residential projects, thoughtful and domestic in their scale. A community bathhouse design with extraordinary sensitivity to water and light. Several studies of threshold details, arches, gates, transitional spaces rendered with the specific obsession of someone who had a theory about them. And there, on the far wall, preliminary sketches for the Mapogu building. Earlier than Jihan had seen, rougher, but carrying the seed of the spatial thinking that had made him understand the project when he walked the site. You had a concept for it already, Jihan said. A direction, not a design. Han Tiju stood beside him looking at his own sketches with the complex expression of someone viewing a version of themselves that didn't quite fit the life they'd built. I knew what I wanted it to feel like, I didn't know how to build the language for it. A pause. That's what I needed you for, not just your technical skill, the specific language you've developed. Jihan turned to look at him. You could have studied architecture professionally, even now. The organization requires what it requires. The flatness in his voice wasn't resignation exactly, more the specific tone of someone who has made peace with a constraint without pretending it isn't one. I made choices. The choices had costs. This is one of them. Do you resent it? Some days, he looked at the community bathhouse drawing. Most days I find the work I do in this room is enough. I have resources to commission the buildings I imagine. That's more than most people who draw get. A pause. And now I have someone to argue with about hanji paper and column proportions, which is. He stopped. Jihan waited. Which is more than I thought this room would ever produce, Han Tiju finished quietly. The statement arrived with its full weight and Jihan let it settle without deflecting. Let himself feel the specific quality of being known by someone who had paid attention, not the performed attention of Xiangmin's early courtship, the elaborate demonstrations of noticing that had turned out to be surveillance, but this. A man in a room full of drawings who had looked at Jihan's work and recognized its language as something he'd been trying to speak himself. The bathhouse design, Jihan said, moving back to it. The water circulation here is wrong. You've got the thermal gradient reversed, cold water descends. You need to account for that in the floor material transition or you lose the spatial temperature logic. He traced the section drawing without touching it. But the entry sequence is extraordinary. This antechamber proportion, the way it creates an intermediate temperature zone before the main space. I spent 3 months on that proportion, Han Tiju said. Something had shifted in his voice, the same quality Jihan had heard in his own voice when he talked about threshold theory, the particular aliveness of someone operating in their actual element. There's a bathhouse in Jeonju, traditional, partially restored. The antechamber there uses a step ceiling to manage the transition. I went 4 times before I understood the mechanism. I know that bathhouse, Jihan turned to him. I did a study of it in my 2nd year. The ceiling step is only 11 centimeters, but the acoustic change is completely distinct from the thermal. It's doing 2 things simultaneously with one gesture. That's exactly it, Han Tiju said, with the intensity of someone who has been trying to articulate a specific thing for a long time and just heard it accurately named. One gesture, multiple functions, the best architectural details always. Are never single purpose, Jihan finished. They looked at each other in the room full of drawings. The threshold quality of the moment was unmistakable this time. Jihan thought about what he'd told Han Tiju weeks ago. I need to trust my own reading of a situation before I act on it. He thought about the weeks of careful observation, of testing his own perceptions against evidence rather than assumption, of watching Han Tiju in every kind of light the days provided. He thought about his own drawings on the studio wall, the atrium with its columns and its vertical garden, the threshold sequence built into every level transition, the building becoming itself. He thought about a man who kept his impossible drawings in a locked room and called it the place where things he couldn't act on lived. TJUSSI, he said. Han Tiju looked at him, waiting with the quality of someone who had learned to hold what they wanted carefully rather than reaching for it. I think, Jihan said carefully, that I've been testing my perception of this situation for several weeks. I know, Han Tiju said quietly. And I think my perception is accurate. He held Han Tiju's gaze, which means I'm choosing from information rather than hope this time, and the choice I'm making is. He took the step that closed the distance between them. Han Tiju went absolutely still, the stillness of someone receiving something they've prepared for carefully and are discovering is still more than they prepared for. The choice I'm making, Jihan continued, his voice steady, is to ask if you want to start, whatever this is, from here. Han Tiju's hand lifted, the same deliberate gesture Jihan had seen on the rooftop weeks ago, hovering near rather than touching, always asking. His dark eyes were very steady and held something that had been under architectural control for weeks and was now, fractionally, showing its actual scale. Yes, he said, the word was simple and complete and carried the weight of everything they'd built toward it. From here. When Jihan leaned into the touch this time, it was fully deliberate, no biology, no crisis, no fear making the decision by default. Just his own clear choice, moving towards something he'd assessed with every tool he had and found to be structurally sound. Han Tiju's thumb traced his cheekbone with the same devastating gentleness as the rooftop, but this time without the shadow of Jay's bruise beneath it. Just Jihan's face, just this. They stood in the room full of drawings for a long time, not rushing past the moment into whatever came next, letting it be complete in itself the way a good threshold moment should be, fully inhabited, fully chosen. The morning after arrived without drama, which felt like its own kind of gift. Jihan woke in his room. He'd returned to it the previous night without ceremony, the evening ending with the same kitchen tea and quiet conversation that had become their established rhythm, simply carrying new weight now, new warmth, and lay in the specific quality of morning light that the northeast window produced and felt the particular settledness of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. He called his parents. His mother answered on the second ring with the barely contained anxiety of someone who had been keeping their phone nearby. He told her he was safe and working. He told her about the Mapogu project in enough detail that the reality of it displaced Xiangmin's narrative, not by arguing with it but by being more substantial than it, more present, more demonstrably true. His father came on the line and said very little but breathed in the particular way of someone whose chest had been tight for weeks and was now releasing. Come visit, Jihan said. When the project reaches the construction phase, I want you to see the building. You'll bring us yourself, his mother asked. I'll bring you myself, he said, and meant it as more than logistics, meant the self he was in the process of recovering, the one who designed buildings and argued about Hanji paper and understood threshold theory and was slowly, carefully learning to trust his own foundations again. After he hung up, Yoonjung appeared in his doorway with coffee and the expression of someone who had been conducting an observation study and was prepared to share findings. You seem different this morning, she said. I'm the same as yesterday. You seem different from yesterday then. She handed him the coffee and sat in the worktable chair, folding her legs beneath her with the casual ease of someone making herself at home in her brother's space. Good different. Jihan drank his coffee. Outside, Seoul was doing its morning things, the particular layered sound of a city resuming after night, traffic and voices, and the distant percussion of construction somewhere to the north. I asked him to start something, Jihan said last night. Yoonjung was quiet for a moment, then and he said yes. He paused, carefully, without pressure in either direction. She nodded slowly, the specific nod of someone who had formed an assessment over several days of careful observation and was watching it be confirmed. How do you feel? Like I made a decision with accurate information. He paused, scared, but the right kind of scared, the kind that comes from choosing something real rather than the kind that comes from being trapped. Yoonjung looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing something complicated, the emotion of someone who loves a person and has watched them be diminished and is now watching them remember their own dimensions. Good, she said, simple, complete, the assessment of someone whose standards had been fully met. 3 days later, Xiangmin made his most serious move. Attorney O called at 8 a.m. with the specific tone of her voice that Jihan had come to recognize as bad news being delivered with maximum professional efficiency. He's filed with the Omega Welfare Authority, she said. Emergency assessment request. He's claiming you're in an exploitative bonding situation with a known criminal figure, that your psychological stability is compromised, and that your public statement was produced under coercion. A pause. He's also submitted alleged medical documentation suggesting a history of Omega psychological instability predating your relationship with him. Jihan sat very still. The documentation is fabricated. Almost certainly, we'll demonstrate that, but an OWA emergency assessment creates a mandatory review period during which during which they can place me in supervised custody if they determine I'm at risk, Jihan said. He knew the law, he'd researched it during the months of planning his escape, had understood it as one of Seongmin's potential weapons. How long do we have? The assessment hearing is scheduled for 10 days from now. We have time to prepare. I'm already contacting our medical expert witnesses. The fabricated documentation will not survive scrutiny. Her voice was precise and calm. I want you to understand that this is a delaying tactic, not a winning strategy. He cannot prevail on the merits, but the hearing itself will be difficult, Jihan said. Yes, I understand. He found Han Tiju in his office 20 minutes later. Han Tiju listened to the entire summary without interrupting, his expression doing the specific thing it did when he was receiving tactical information, still, absorbing, already organizing response while the input was still arriving. When Jihan finished, the silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. The fabricated medical documentation, Han Tiju said, it will have been produced by someone, a physician willing to certify false records. That person has a professional registration, a licensing body, a paper trail. He looked at Jihan. We find them and we find the documentation of the fabrication before the hearing. That's 10 days. Nam Gilsu has done more in less time. He paused. The OWA assessment itself, you'll need to be present, you'll need to testify. Are you prepared for that? Yes, the certainty in his own voice surprised him slightly. A month ago it wouldn't have been there. He wants me to feel exposed and overwhelmed. He's been using the hearing as a threat for weeks. He met Han Tiju's eyes. I'm done being threatened by it. I want to walk into that room and be more present than he can handle. Han Tiju looked at him for a moment with that focused, open quality that still occasionally caught Jihan off guard, the version of him that the careful architecture didn't fully conceal. There he is, Han Tiju said quietly. What? The architect who forgets to be afraid. His voice was careful, precise, and underneath the precision something that was warm in a way that had nothing to do with performance. I've been watching for him since the night you came through my entrance. Jihan felt the warmth rise in his chest, not heat, not biology, not anything that could be weaponized. Just the specific sensation of being accurately seen by someone who had looked carefully and without agenda and found the actual structure beneath the damage. Help me prepare, Jihan said. Every hour until the hearing if you need it. Han Tiju turned to his desk. But first, he paused, and in the pause, Jihan heard the careful person choosing careful words. Are you all right? Not tactically, actually. Jihan considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I'm frightened, he said, and I'm angry, and underneath both of those things I'm certain, in a way I haven't been for a long time. He held Han Tiju's gaze. I know what I'm walking toward, I know what the building looks like from here. The fear is about the construction phase, not about whether the design is right. Han Tiju's expression did something that Jihan was beginning to be able to read. The fractional unlocking that meant the response underneath, the careful exterior was larger than the one being shown. Then we build it, Han Tiju said simply. Outside, Seoul moved through its ordinary Wednesday rhythms, indifferent and enormous and full of people navigating their own load-bearing walls. Inside, 2 people with sharp edges and careful foundations began to prepare for the most important hearing of one of their lives. And in the studio 2 floors up, on a wall covered in drawings, the Mapogu atrium weighted columns standing in their patient rhythm, light moving through the space in slow geometry, the whole structure holding its breath before the moment it would finally, completely, become what it had always been meant to be. The Omega Welfare Authority hearing room was designed to feel neutral. Jihan understood the intention, the careful beige walls, the even institutional lighting, the circular table arrangement that implied equivalence between parties. Someone had made deliberate spatial choices to suggest that this was a place where no single perspective dominated, where the architecture itself modeled fairness. He also understood, with the professional eye he couldn't turn off even here, that the intention had not been fully achieved. The OWA assessors sat on a raised platform, subtle, only 15 centimeters, but sufficient to establish hierarchy. The lighting was even everywhere except slightly warmer above the assessor's position, drawing the eye upward. The circular table was positioned closer to the respondent's side than the applicant's, a detail so minor most people would never consciously register it. He registered it. He also registered that registering it was his mind doing what it did under pressure, finding the spatial logic of a situation as a way of establishing his own position within it, understanding the room, understanding that he knew how rooms worked and this one, despite its intentions, was just architecture, deliberate, readable, ultimately just a series of choices someone had made. He knew how to work with that. The 10 days before the hearing had been the most concentrated period of Jihan's professional and personal life simultaneously. Attorney O had organized the preparation with the systematic efficiency of someone who treated legal proceedings the way Jihan treated buildings, as problems of spatial logic, each element requiring its correct position relative to the others. Expert witnesses, a medical specialist in Omega psychology who would address the fabricated instability documentation, a bond specialist who would detail the forensic evidence of the consent forgery, an independent architect who would speak to Jihan's professional standing and the Mapogu Commission's legitimacy. Namgilsu had found the physician who'd produced the false psychiatric records within 4 days. He presented the findings with his characteristic professional neutrality and the specific expression of someone who had done unpleasant things in the service of a result they believed in. The physician's licensing records showed 2 previous disciplinary actions. The payments from Seongmin's accounts to a shell consulting company were documented across 18 months. The records themselves bore technical inconsistencies that the medical expert had identified in under an hour. Han Tiju had been present for every preparation session and entirely absent from every decision. That distinction mattered to Jihan in ways he kept finding new angles on. Han Tiju sat in the room, listened, contributed tactical analysis when asked, and consistently, completely deferred to Jihan and Attorney O on every substantive choice. When Jihan had said he wanted to testify personally rather than relying solely on documentary evidence, Han Tiju had said that's your decision, and then spent 3 evenings helping him prepare his testimony with the focused attention of someone who understood that the best preparation didn't shape what was said, but helped the speaker find their own clearest version of it. What do you want them to understand? Han Tiju had asked the first evening, not what do you need to prove or what will be most effective, what do you want them to understand? Jihan had sat with the question for a long time. That I know who I am, he'd said finally. That he spent 18 months trying to make me forget and I haven't forgotten. That I'm not a person who needs to be retrieved. I'm a person who made a choice. Then that's your testimony, Han Tiju had said. Everything else is supporting documentation. Seongmin arrived at the hearing with 2 attorneys and the particular presentation of a man who had dressed very carefully to appear casually certain. Charcoal suit, no tie, the studied informality of someone performing ease. His alpha projection was controlled, professional, the version of it that Jihan had once found compelling before he'd understood that it was a tool rather than a quality. Their eyes met across the hearing room. Jihan felt the familiar pull of old fear, the specific physical memory of 18 months of conditioning, the body's learned response to that particular scent and presence. He felt it completely, acknowledged it, and set it to one side with the same deliberate motion he used when identifying a structural problem in a design, noted, understood, not allowed to determine the outcome. He looked away first, not from intimidation. From the simple economy of attention, there were more important things to look at. Attorney O sat beside him. Yoonjung sat in the observers section with their parents who had arrived from Busan 2 days ago. His mother had held his face in both hands for a long time when she saw him and said nothing, which was its own complete language. His father had looked at the drawings on the studio wall and said you're working with the specific relief of a parent whose deepest concern has been answered. Han Tiju was not in the room. This had been a joint decision made carefully. His presence would create the narrative Seongmin wanted: dangerous criminal figure, exploitative bond situation, Omega under alpha influence. His absence made the hearing about what it was actually about: Jihan, his choices, his testimony, his evidence. I'll be outside, Han Tiju had said that morning. Simple, complete, whatever you need after. The hearing opened with Attorney O presenting the documentary evidence. She was exceptional at this. Jihan had watched her work for 10 days and had developed the professional admiration of someone recognizing mastery in an adjacent field. She laid evidence the way a good designer laid spatial sequence, each element positioned to create inevitable understanding. The conclusion arrived at through logic rather than argument. The audience led to see something rather than being told to believe it. The forensic bond analysis, the fabricated consent documentation, the medical records from Jihan's hospitalization proving the signature had been given under sedation, the physician's payments and disciplinary history. The 18 months of financial records showing progressive account restriction, the systematic isolation documented through phone records and testimony from 2 former colleagues who had lost contact with Jihan during the period in question and had attempted to reach him without success. Seongmin's attorneys objected at intervals. The objections were technically competent and strategically insufficient. Attorney O had anticipated all of them. Then Jihan testified. He'd thought carefully about how to begin. The standard approach, chronological, documentary, structured around evidence, was correct for most of the testimony, but the opening mattered differently. The opening was where the hearing room would calibrate its understanding of who he was. He began with the Jeonjo bathhouse. He described standing in its antechamber at age 22, understanding for the first time that a space could accomplish multiple things simultaneously with a single gesture. That architecture was a language for organizing human experience, not just functionally but emotionally, spiritually, in the way it shaped what people felt was possible while they inhabited it. That he had chosen this work because he believed spaces could be honest or dishonest, generous or controlling, and that the difference was in whether the person who designed them thought about what the people inside would need. He watched the assessor's attention change quality as he spoke, saw them stop reading documents and start listening. Then he described what Seongmin had done. Not dramatically, not with the emotional texture that might read as instability, but with the precise spatial language of his profession, describing the architecture of the control as a designer would, identifying each structural element, each load-bearing constraint, each carefully designed limitation on what felt possible from inside it. He built a space that looked like a relationship, Jihan said. It had all the visible elements, care, attention, support, but the design was wrong at the foundation. The foundation was his authority and my containment, and everything built on it served that function regardless of how it appeared on the surface. Good architecture is honest about what it is. What he built was dishonest, and I am an architect, I know the difference. The room was very quiet. I am not missing, he continued, with the complete steadiness of someone who has arrived at the sentence they've been building toward. I am not in crisis. I am not under anyone's influence or control. I am a man who identified the structural failure in a situation he was trapped in, planned carefully, and left. I am currently doing the most significant work of my professional life. And I am here today because someone used legal infrastructure the way he used every other kind of infrastructure, as a tool to limit what I could do and where I could go. He looked at the assessors directly. I am asking you to see the design for what it is. Seongmin testified after. Jihan watched him with the detached analytical attention he'd applied to the hearing room's spatial choices, reading the performance rather than feeling it. The concerned alpha, the bewildered partner, the careful projection of someone who genuinely couldn't understand why the person they loved had fled. He was good at it, Jihan had once found it entirely convincing. Now he could see the load-bearing elements underneath. The subtle emphasis on Jihan's Omega status at every opportunity, the framing of independence as instability, of professional commitment as displacement behavior, of Han Tiju's building as a criminal environment rather than a workplace. The twice-repeated suggestion that an Omega in Jihan's psychological state couldn't be expected to make fully autonomous decisions. An Omega in Jihan's psychological state. The phrase did something in Jihan's chest, not fear this time but a clean, clarifying anger. The specific anger of someone watching a familiar mechanism operate in plain sight and having, for once, the position and the voice to name it. Attorney O named it in her closing submission with surgical precision. She identified every instance in Seongmin's testimony where Omega status had been used as a qualifier for psychological reliability. She presented the medical expert's analysis of the fabricated psychiatric records. She noted that the OWA's own guidelines prohibited assessment proceedings initiated by former partners in bond disputes where fraudulent bonding was under active legal review. She was, Jihan thought, extraordinary. The assessors deliberated for 40 minutes. Jihan sat in the hallway outside with Yoonjung on one side, and his mother on the other, and his father standing nearby doing the specific thing fathers did when they wanted to be useful and didn't know how, maintaining steady, deliberate proximity. His phone showed a message from Han Tiju, 4 words. However it goes here. Jihan looked at the message for a moment, then put his phone in his pocket with the specific feeling of something small and structurally significant clicking into place. Yoonjung's hand found his, didn't say anything, didn't need to. When the assessors returned, their decision was read by the senior assessor in the flat, precise language of official determination. The emergency assessment petition was denied. The applicant had failed to demonstrate credible grounds for welfare intervention. The respondent had demonstrated clear capacity for autonomous decision-making, stable professional functioning, and voluntary residential circumstances. The fabricated psychiatric documentation had been referred to the Medical Licensing Authority for investigation. And then, in a closing paragraph that Attorney O had not anticipated, and that made something fundamental shift in the quality of the room's air. The senior assessor noted that the board found the application itself to constitute a misuse of OWA emergency proceedings, and that the circumstances of the fraudulent bonding documentation had been referred to the public prosecutor's office for review. Seongmin's attorney was already leaning toward him before the assessor finished speaking. Jihan sat very still for a moment. Then his mother made a sound beside him that wasn't quite crying, more the exhalation of weeks of held breath releasing all at once, and his father's hand landed on his shoulder with the specific weight of a man who had always expressed things through presence rather than words, and Yoonjung said something under her breath that was probably not language she used around their parents normally. And Attorney O turned from the assessor's platform with the expression of someone whose work had done exactly what it was built to do. Han Tiju was in the building's entrance when they returned. He wasn't performing waiting, wasn't positioned dramatically, wasn't managing the quality of his own presence. He was simply there, near the threshold, with the door open behind him and the afternoon light coming through at the angle that always made the entrance look most like what it was meant to be. Jihan walked through the entrance and kept walking until the distance between them was gone. Han Tiju's arms came around him with the specific quality of someone who had been careful for a very long time and was briefly, completely, allowing themselves to not be. One hand on Jahan's back, one at the back of his head, the cedar and ink scent surrounding him like a room whose proportions were exactly right. Neither of them spoke. Behind them, Jahan was distantly aware of Yoonjung guiding his parents toward the kitchen, of Nam Gilsu appearing and disappearing with the professional tact that was one of his most consistent qualities, of the building settling around this moment with the generosity of a space that had been designed to hold what people needed it to hold. After a while, Han Tiju said very quietly into his hair, "Tell me." "We won." Jahan's voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "All of it. The petition denied, the fabricated records referred to the licensing authority, the fraud referred to the prosecutor." He paused. "He's going to face actual consequences." Han Tiju's hold tightened fractionally. "You did that." "We did that." "You walked into that room and you spoke for yourself and you were more present than he could handle." The precision in his voice carried something warm underneath it. "That was you, your words, your design." Jihan pulled back enough to look at his face. The sharp angles holding their usual careful arrangement, but something in the eyes that was the largest thing Jihan had seen there, unguarded, unarchitected, simply the man underneath all the carefully constructed protective structures. "I want to show you something," Jihan said. He took Han Tiju to the studio. The wall of drawings had grown over the weeks until it covered all four walls, the Mapugu project in its full development, from early concept sketches through the current construction documents, the atrium with its columns, the vertical garden system, the threshold sequence built into every level transition. The Hanji screen installation for the upper office corridor, finally specified after testing 3 papermakers' work and finding the weight and translucency that created exactly the quality of filtered light the space required. Han Tiju stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, reading the walls. "It's complete," he said. "The design phase is complete. Construction begins in 3 weeks." Jihen moved to stand beside him. "I want to be on site through the entire build. I want to be there when the columns are refinished, when the irrigation system goes into the steel, when the first Hanji screens are installed." He paused. "I want to see it become what it's supposed to be." "You'll be there for all of it." Han Tiju looked at the atrium drawing. "Every day if you want." Jihan looked at the drawing with him. The columns standing in their patient rhythm, the light falling through the clear story in geometry that he'd calculated across dozens of iterations, the threshold sequence that would tell people exactly where they were and what the space invited them to feel. "I want to tell you something," he said. Hantiju turned to look at him. Present, careful, waiting with the quality of someone who had learned that the best thing he could do with what he wanted was hold it without crowding the space around it. "When I came through your entrance that night," Jihan said, "I had nothing, no phone, no money, no plan beyond the next 30 seconds. I had been running for 3 days and I was failing in every way a person can fail." He held Han Tiju's gaze. "And your building stopped me, the architecture stopped me and made me choose. And I walked through your threshold and you let me stay and you," he paused, finding the right words with the precision they deserved, "you gave me back the conditions under which I could remember who I was." Han Tiju's expression was doing its complex unlocking, the sharp angles of his face showing their underlying geography. "You didn't need me to remember," Han Tiju said quietly. "You had it the whole time, you just needed space without someone standing in it telling you otherwise." "I know," Jihan looked at him, "but you built the space that matters." He took the step that closed the distance. "You matter not as protection, not as resources, not as a countermove against Seongmin. You specifically, the man who draws buildings in a locked room and grows things on his roof and makes careful distinctions between strategic and careful and stayed outside a door all night because he understood what consent actually means." Hantiju lifted his hand in the gesture Jihan now knew, hovering near rather than touching, always asking. Jihan caught his hand and held it. "You don't have to ask anymore," he said, "not like that, not with that particular carefulness." He turned Han Tiju's hand in his, looked at the ink climbing his forearm, the precise hands that drew buildings in a locked room. "I'm choosing fully clearly from accurate information." He looked up. "You can stop being quite so careful." Something in Han Tiju changed, a fundamental shift in the quality of his stillness, from controlled restraint to actual peace. His other hand came up to Jihan's face, and this time it didn't hover. "I'll still be careful," he said, with something at the corner of his mouth that was the smile Jihan had catalogued over weeks, small and genuine and slightly self-aware. "It's a character trait." "I know, I like it." Jihan leaned into the touch. "Just know that I'm here, I'm staying, not from need or fear or anywhere that isn't choice." Hantiju looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes that had been calculating something the night Jihan arrived and had, he now understood, been calculating it every day since. Not a tactical outcome, but something harder to plan for. Something that arrived through patience and honesty and the willingness to build slowly rather than claim quickly. "Then I'll try," Han Tiju said softly, "to be worthy of the choice." He kissed Jihan with the same quality that had been present in everything he'd done since the night of the rain-soaked entrance. Considered, generous, nothing taken that hadn't been offered, but warmer now than careful. The warmth of something that had been waiting the appropriate amount of time and was now finally fully present. The Mapogu Cultural Complex opened 11 months later. It opened on a Saturday in early autumn, when the light came through Seoul's particular season at the angle that made the city look like it had been reconsidered. Jihan stood in the atrium and watched it happen, watched the columns do what he'd known they would do, the vertical garden reaching its late-season fullness, the climbing species turned to amber and rust and the last green of the year, the hangy screens on the upper floors filtering the afternoon into something that moved between light and privacy with the ease of breath. People moved through the threshold sequence without knowing they were doing it, pausing at each transition, recalibrating without understanding why, finding themselves in each new space with the specific quality of people who know where they are and feel comfortable in that knowledge. A woman stood in the main gallery for a long time looking up at the column-integrated hanging system, at the way the structural rhythm had become the curatorial logic. She said something to her companion that Jihan couldn't hear. He didn't need to. He knew what the building was doing. Namgilsu appeared beside him with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 15 years. TJUSSI is looking for you. Jihan found him on the third-floor threshold, the transitional level between the public cultural space and the private offices, where the hangy screens first appeared, where the building's register shifted from open to intimate. He was standing at the railing looking down into the atrium, watching the people below move through the space with the attentiveness of someone who had waited a long time to see something become what it was meant to be. He turned when he heard Jihan's. In 11 months, certain things had become established between them. The specific rhythm of their mornings, Han Tiju with documents and cold tea, Jihan with coffee and sketchbooks, the kitchen table accommodating both with the ease of a space that had been used well, the building's rooftop in all its seasons, the Jiangsu maintaining their patient vigil at the parapet. The locked study on the second floor, now unlocked, where Han Tiju's drawings had been joined by Jihan's and the walls had developed a quality of accumulated conversation. The hangy screens that Jihan had installed in their shared spaces, 3 of them, in the corridor between Han Tiju's office and Jihan's studio, filtering the light that passed between their working worlds into something that moved between private and known. Protection that breathed, strong enough to last, soft enough to filter light without killing it. The atrium, Han Tiju said. I know. The column rhythm when people move through it. He paused in the specific way of someone whose professional language wasn't quite reaching the thing they were trying to name. It's like the space is. Breathing, Jihan said. Han Tiju looked at him, yes. Jihan stood beside him at the railing and looked down at the building that had been waiting to become itself. That was now, finally, completely what it had always been meant to be. I want to start on the bathhouse, he said. Han Tiju turned to him, the design from the locked room. The antechamber proportion is right, the water circulation needs rebuilding from scratch, but the spatial concept is extraordinary. He looked at Han Tiju. I want to build it properly. With you, your concept, my execution, both of us arguing about every detail until it's exactly right. Something moved through Han Tiju's expression, the full unlocking of it, none of the careful architecture in the way. Just the man who drew buildings in a locked room, who grew things on his roof, who had stayed outside a door all night because he understood the difference between claiming and choosing. That would be, he started. I know, Jihan said. Han Tiju laughed, quietly, genuinely, with the quality of something that had been a long time finding the right conditions to exist. It changed his face completely, the sharp angles rearranging themselves around something unguarded and real and larger than the careful structure usually allowed to show. Jihan thought about the night he had run through Seoul's rain-soaked streets toward a threshold that stopped him and made him choose. About walking through an entrance designed by a man who believed boundaries should have guardians and crossings should be deliberate. About the months of careful, patient construction of a building, of a self, of something between two people that had been built the only way anything worth building gets built. Threshold by threshold, choice by choice, each element finding its correct position relative to the others, the whole becoming coherent without being forced. He took Han Tiju's hand. Below them, the atrium breathed. The columns stood in their patient rhythm, the light moved through the vertical garden in its slow geometry, the people moved through the threshold sequence with the ease of people who know exactly where they are. And in the upper corridor, where the hangy screens filtered the afternoon into something between light and shelter, 2 people stood at the railing of something they had built together, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific difficulty of building anything worth building, and looked at what they had made. It held. It was always going to hold. Now please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and I wanted to ask you about past commit and commit section. I am promising you I will read every single commit and try to reply to it.